Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free.
The March on Washington, I know it was Martin Luther King Jr.
I solely know about the speech from Martin Luther King.
It was a really powerful speech. It was really cool.
Like us being able to like protest and like stand against that and like not being violent, not going back and rioting, but just marching and walking.
The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963 was the most influential event in the history of civil rights and the history of America. The march had the greatest number of people gathered together for civil rights in American history. As you just saw, the most memorable part of this march was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivering his I Have a Dream speech. However, this speech is not an accurate sample of the march as a whole, and as such has blurred the way Americans remember and view the event.
The march was organized by A. Philip Randolph, a civil rights activist, and after trying to organize a march earlier around the time of World War II and eventually having to call it off, Randolph was very excited to see his dream of the march finally come true. Working together with Bayard Rustin and several other civil rights activist groups such as SNCC, SCLC, and CORE, the protest was called together in an effort to fight the everyday plight of African Americans for freedom and jobs. The everyday plight of African Americans included inadequate wages, a lack of job training, and discrimination in segregated schools and an unjust job market. With specific goals in mind, the march hosted a large number of keynote speakers such as John Lewis, who delivered speeches with a specific intent of announcing the larger intentions of the event.
Many were so relieved that the march didn't end in a riot that the goals and the intentions of the protesters were completely ignored. This response suggests how little Americans at large believed in the peaceful goals and intentions of the civil rights activists, including SNCC.
The coverage of this event has shaped the way that Americans remember what the march was about, and as such has become known more for a message of colorblindness as opposed to the more radical goals that were clearly set forth by the organizers. This perspective of the protest became more and more popular after the assassination of MLK in 1968. His uplifting message, reminiscent of the American dream, was something that every American could latch onto, and seems much more appealing than the tone of the entire event. Unfortunately, this limited perspective denies the movement so much of the message that was actually intended.
In the same way that the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom is remembered today largely for the platform provided for Dr. King to speak, the American memory of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s centers around Dr. King almost exclusively, while forgetting many other important figures of the civil rights movement. When talking to average Americans, as we've seen, about how change came about during and after the civil rights movement, the shorter answer is Martin Luther King Jr. However, this is not representative of the movement as a whole. The movement consisted of a myriad of small and large activist groups which had varying goals but similar interests. The call for colorblindness in the I Have a Dream speech downplays the greater struggle for Americans, which is to learn about racial issues and allow for the healing power of consciousness and time to remove biases and discrimination against African Americans. Dr. King proposes that the goal was to look past the color of one another's skin, but however, the goals of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom were based on the need for increased minimum wage and non-discriminatory employment practices and not colorblindness. In 1963, schools were still practicing segregation despite the Brown versus Board case. The issues were very political, whereas the memory of the event is very socially driven.
The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom began with radical goals and steps toward equality and civil liberties. And although this perspective has largely been lost over time, it is still possible to rekindle the original intent and spirit of the march.
Through an inaccurate memory about what the civil rights movement was about and the March on Washington, it becomes easy to forget about the specific issues and the goals that march and the movement was about. This has never been really an issue about African Americans and white Americans not getting along. It's more of an issue about legislation and systematic issues which have need to be dealt with, such as maybe housing or job issues or whatever the case may be. Even though that the 60s seemed like they were a long time ago, many of our mothers and fathers were actually born during this era. So it is in our blood to overcome many of these issues. It is our inheritance to solve these issues that we have at hand. And by missing the historical significance of the march, we a lot of times overlook many of those issues, and what ends up happening is we get caught up in a vicious cycle of the same issues and they never become solved.